Hey YouTube, welcome back to another History Teacher Reacts video. Mr. Terry, as I continue my search for historical knowledge found here on YouTube. Alright, today's video comes from our awesome patron pledgers, and they voted on this video for this week, and that is 10 ways World War II could have ended differently, by the channel All Time Tens. Wow, that opens a lot of doors to a lot of things. 10 ways World War II could have ended differently. I mean, obviously there could be a lot of ways. And I'm interested to see what they do in the realm of possibility. I always think that's important in these hypothetical videos, is it needs to be in the realm of possibility. And I'm interested to see what they, I guess, kind of come up with that. And I'm sure you are too. But yeah, thank you to our patron pledgers. Thank you so much for pledging and being a part of this community. And if you'd like to join, you can do that too down below in the comments. There's a link to Patreon. You can check that out. All right, as always, before we begin, if you like this original video, the link to it is down below. Make sure you click it, go to view, like, subscribe. And if you haven't subbed to my channel, I'd love to have you around and be a part of our fun community as well. All right, let's go ahead and get started. 10 ways World War II could have ended differently. We are going to war, and we have to prepare. Let's do it.
10 ways World War II could have ended differently. Number 10, Operation Unthinkable.
Don't know this one.
As the following 5 decades
If it's a real thing.
showed, the Second World War didn't end on entirely comfortable terms between the Western powers and Russia. But in 1998, we learned that Churchill had considered a more extreme plan for after the Yalta Conference to discuss Europe's post-war reorganisation. Scheduled for the 1st of July 1945, Churchill had conceived a plan for British, US, Polish and German forces to liberate Poland and East Germany from Stalin's communist encroachment into Europe.
Now, what you need to understand about this is, why is this even a thing? Was that during the war, there were a couple of meetings, right, between the big powers, the Allied powers, and they were outlining things as the war was going on, specifically to have plans for the post-war world. And one of the things that was agreed upon was, especially towards Stalin, was that after the war, Stalin and the Soviet Union would need to vacate, basically, those nations that they had invaded. So they had invaded into Poland and then other Eastern European nations as kind of part of the war, and kind of before too, and making that deal with Adolf Hitler. They would split Poland and stuff like that. And the Allies, though, okay, now FDR, he died right before the war ended, and but we're always very cautious of Joseph Stalin. They didn't really trust him, and a lot of you guys know that. Even before World War II, the sort of Western world was far more fearful of Joseph Stalin than they were Adolf Hitler, right? And probably why it took so long to actually kind of team up with the Russians. But they all knew that it'd be hard to maybe to keep a deal with him. And it was kind of right, because in the end, at the end of the war, the Soviet Union did not leave those places and hold general elections and stuff like that. They kept them, and the justification for Joseph Stalin was, hey, we have now been invaded twice by Western Europe. Germany specifically. We should be allowed to protect ourselves and our front by stationing some kind of presence in these nations as a buffer zone. And that logic's pretty airtight. But the simple breaking of that sort of deal that they had with Stalin is going to immediately pretty much cause the issues that are going to lead to the Cold War and the distrust that will happen between the Soviet Union and the West. All right, talking too much.
The idea was to get a square deal for Poland after it became clear that Stalin betrayed his promise for free elections. But it soon became a defensive plan once the Allies realised taking on the mighty Russian bear was, to quote the National Archives, fanciful. In any case, if this operation actually went ahead, it could have gone one of two ways. Either the coalition forces took East Germany and Poland, leaving an awfully uncomfortable standoff with the USSR, or it would have failed, got messy, and caused World War III immediately after World War II.
I mean, remember, this is right after. They're talking in July here. Okay, the fighting in Western Europe ended in the end of April, early May. You're going to immediately go after allies? Ooh, I mean, that's hard, but you're right. I mean, they're right. They could have changed things differently. What if the Allies immediately, once they saw that Stalin and the Soviets were not going to leave Poland, just went in? Interesting. Now, how would that end the war? I mean, the war was over. The World War II was over. I guess what have happened is the war, in a way, continues as allies are going against each other. And I mean, they're saying a World War III. I don't know what allies Soviet Union would be bringing in quite at this time, but because like China is not involved yet, as sort of a semi-alliance with them. So
Come on, everyone knows to at least give it a year before the sequel. Number 9.
it is just one thing to add. That's kind of well, no, timing is important here. July is also when the United States finishes up the atomic bomb testing. So United States would have had that as a big flex move to use in the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union did not get the atomic bomb until about 4 years later in 1949. Operation Sea Lion. Okay, so invasion of Britain. Had this gone differently, what if the Germans actually were successful in taking Britain?
History buffs or Christopher Nolan fans will know that the UK was at a particularly low point after the evacuation of Dunkirk in 1940. In fact, we were in such a sorry state that Hitler ordered Führer Directive 16, which stated, "The aim of this operation will be to eliminate the English homeland."
That's some harsh words right there. Eliminate the English homeland. Now, like you're saying, it's important to remember after the German success at Dunkirk, which virtually kicked the British out of mainland Europe, right? It's they're done. That the tide was turning towards the Germans in their fight with the British because they had kicked them out of basically Europe, and so they had the momentum going. But one thing to think about here is there something the Germans could have done to be more successful in Operation Sea Lion, which was the attack on the actual British homeland? I wonder if they'll bring that up.
As a base for the prosecution of the war against Germany, and, if necessary, to occupy it. The operation in question was called Sea Lion, which involved a naval invasion followed by the capture of MPs, intellectuals, and outspoken enemies of the Reich. It was originally planned for just 8 weeks after Dunkirk. However, luckily that never happened, since the Luftwaffe's defeat in the Battle of Britain stopped Germany from controlling the skies to support the invasion. As a result, the invasion was delayed again and again. Eventually, Sea Lion was abandoned in favour of Operation Barbarossa, which aimed to take Moscow and topple the Soviet Union. That disastrous campaign eventually cost Germany more than 4 million lives,
and the war,
around 80% of its total war losses.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much it cost in the war. Going back to Sea Lion, so the whole blitzkrieg fighting style basically comes in 3 parts. Okay, and you see the Germans do this in the places that they were successful as well, which is, first part is the air war. Okay, superiority of the air. You bomb your targets, you start with logistical targets, and then potentially could go on civilian targets to basically ruin will. And then it's the on-ground heavy machinery, the tanks. Bring in the panzers, so that's wave 2. You bring that in, and then wave 3 is usually your traditional foot soldiers. And Operation Sea Lion never really got past part 1, because you can't do part 2, the land invasion, without clearing the air, right, and clearing the space to be able to do that. And they never got past that. Although places like London were in just ruins pretty much. Apparently, the Germans never thought it was enough that they could have safely landed those troops. And when you're invading a place like the British Isles, that is a very different story, because you have to completely dominate the air and the water to be able to safely move stuff across the English Channel. It's much easier to do just straight across land. So that ended up failing at them. But yeah, interesting that they could have, because people say, what if the Germans just stopped right there? What if they just stopped? They had the Russians in their back pocket because they had the deal between Stalin and Hitler, basically, with the two, that they wouldn't fight each other. They defeated France, they defeated Northern Europe. And what if they had just stopped there? Would this be seen as more a successful military campaign? But then going then into Russia and basically backstabbing the Russians ended up beginning the end for them. As you saw, as the Russians were able to push back and then defeat the Soviets.
So, who knows? If Hitler went with Sea Lion over Barbarossa, his war effort might have not ended quite so poorly.
You guys can comment on this. Could Sea Lion have been successful? Could Operation Sea Lion have been successful? And did they necessarily abandon Sea Lion by doing Operation Barbarossa? Or what were the Germans doing is, hey, Operation Sea Lion failed. Okay, this is the next operation. Not, hey, we're doing this instead. Does that make sense? Let me know in the comments what you think there.
Number 8. No Pearl Harbor.
This is an obvious one, right? What would have happened? Would the United States have joined directly? Now, we all know the United States was giving war materials to the Allies at this time, but we're not directly fighting per se. So would that have changed it? I mean, this is, I think, the clearest thing that could have changed the war dramatically was one single event. But hypothetical, right? Hindsight's 2020.
It's not a controversial argument to say that Pearl Harbor was the major catalyst for US involvement in World War II.
For sure.
Before then, there was a significant anti-interventionist movement in the country, but that largely dissipated in the face of Japanese aggression. That kind of galvanization is precisely the opposite of what Japan wanted. Naval Commander Isoroku Yamamoto believed it would bring American morale down to such an extent that it cannot be recovered, when in fact it made it obvious that entering the war was unavoidable.
Anytime we talk about Pearl Harbor and the decision to do Pearl Harbor, I have to bring in the Japanese perspective, because it really is amazing how many people, especially in America, don't understand why the attack on Pearl Harbor happened. Okay, the oil embargo. Right, the oil embargo, because of the imperialist activities in Southeast Asia with a lot of America's allies like France and stuff, and their very questionable tactics in China, the Americans sought to sort of stick it to Japan in a way, in the place that would hurt them most: oil. Japan has to have foreign oil. They do not even come close to producing enough oil to fuel their military, to fuel their nation, really. And where do they get most of their oil? From America. So when America blocks the sale of oil to Japan, one of the responses was the attack on Pearl Harbor. That would hopefully end that, and maybe intimidate, like they're saying, intimidate the Americans into ending that oil embargo. Of course, it didn't. It had the opposite effect. But so not that necessarily, I mean, it matters why the Japanese did that. I mean, more as an explanation that you can understand a little bit more clearly.
Even noted isolationist Charles Lindbergh said, "I can see nothing to do under these circumstances except fight. If I had been in Congress, I certainly would have voted for a declaration of war."
That's why Pearl Harbor is such a big deal, because of how many people wanted to stay out of the war. I mean, it was an overnight thing, and you don't get that in a lot of these American wars. Things like World War I, there's no overnight thing. There's a series of events, but an overnight thing that changes American policy. The closest thing to come to that would maybe be the attacks on 9/11. You know, that changed American foreign policy,
But had Pearl Harbor not happened, there's a reasonable chance that the isolationists would have gotten their way, and the US either didn't enter the war or engaged in a reduced capacity. The reduced threat on the Western Front as a result may well have given Germany more resources to take on Stalin and maybe even win. Number 7. Operation Downfall. Dropping the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was undoubtedly a defining factor in the war, not to mention in history.
There's always one of the biggest ones, which is, was the atomic bomb necessary? Right? Russia, within basically hours, was just declaring war on Japan, and the Japanese had lost most of their possessions. Were those necessary? Right? Because Japan was virtually defeated at that time. And that's been a big thing to talk about the last 60 years. So we'll see what they say.
But it wasn't always the plan. Before the nuclear option was taken, Operation Downfall was Plan A. This would have been a traditional invasion, and the largest in history at that, which unsurprisingly would have taken a much greater toll on US forces than forcing the issue via nukes.
This is the biggest thing that people talk about as the defense for using the atomic bomb, was to avoid a land invasion, which would have dwarfed D-Day. We saw the Japanese commitments at this time in their kamikaze fighting and stuff at the end, where they were virtually going last man standing with no surrender. And that was a big part, of course, what the Americans were backing up. The policymakers there was avoiding that. That does separate the idea about Russia then potentially getting involved in fighting the Japanese as well. But just from the American versus Japanese perspective, that's usually cited as the big thing, as justifying the use of the atomic bombs to avoid a land invasion that would have cost many more people possibly than even the atomic bombs did. But you're also talking about civilian casualties versus military casualties, and that's another discussion.
In fact, it would have been so costly that many historians argue Truman dropped the bomb to avoid it. According to historical writer Michael Peck, the American invasion would likely have succeeded, but it could have added an extra 2 years to the war effort and cost as many as 1 million casualties.
I think those are fair numbers, right? I mean, I got to look at some things, but I mean, it seems like those would be fair numbers because, yeah, it wouldn't be overnight. It could take another, like they said, 2 years. After World War II had already been going on for 6 years, which was so long, longer than World War I and more deadly than anything that has ever happened. So the idea of trying to end the war quickly is behind all this, right? But yeah, I've heard that stat a lot, 1 million casualties. I didn't necessarily heard a lot about how long it would take. That it probably would be a success from if it's just America getting involved. But again, we're discounting the Russians involved here, who've had a long history with Japan, and fighting them. Go back to the Russo-Japanese War, the Japanese defeated the Russians.
That would have tripled America's total death toll. After that, the outcome is anyone's guess. Such a fatigued and war-torn US might have shied away from involving itself in world leadership for decades to come. It's even plausible that the memory of Operation Downfall would have kept America out of Vietnam. Number 6.
Can I go back? I want to go back. I mean, I can go back. What's the connection to Vietnam?
The outcome is anyone's guess. Such a fatigued and war-torn US might have shied away from involving itself in world leadership for decades to come. It's even plausible that the memory of Operation Downfall would have kept America out of Vietnam.
Okay, I see the logic there. And as for precedent, I'm looking at like World War I. Americans, especially by the end of the war, at the end of the war, hated the fact that they felt like they had to get involved in this war. It made them further want to be isolationist, right? Didn't do the opposite. Okay. That was like, hey, this was stupid. Let's not get involved in these foreign wars. Okay, that was dumb. Let's not do that again. And why it took so long for the United States to get involved in World War II. So with how deadly even, because they said, it could have been 3 times the casualties for America if the invasion of Japan had happened, that would have put such a bad taste in their mouth, the Americans, that they would be less likely, even more so, to join further wars and maybe not take such a more aggressive stance in places like Vietnam. We should throw in Korea in there. And okay, I mean, I think that is in the realm of possibility. What do you guys think?
Number 6. Operation Valkyrie succeeds.
What if Hitler was assassinated?
The failed plot to assassinate Hitler in 1944 has gone down as one of the great what-if moments in history.
But, okay, it's 1944. The war's been going on for 5 years. How much can it change, really, by 1944? It was already the beginning of the end. So, I mean, what if this had taken place years before? Shoot, before the war, maybe in the first couple years of the war. But 1944... that's a long time. War ends in the beginning of 45.
Having been so close yet so far from success, it's hard not to wonder what would have happened if the Führer's reign was cut short. Just for some context, Operation Valkyrie was a plan led by Klaus von Stauffenberg for the German Reserve Army to overthrow the Nazi regime. And the July 20th plot was the actual assassination attempt where a briefcase bomb happened to move and only injure Hitler. If all had gone to plan, it's tempting to think that it would have broken Hitler's vice grip on Germany and heralded the end of the conflict.
Can I go ahead and throw in a better hypothetical of how World War II could have ended differently by it maybe not happening? I think a lot of you know the story of, is it Private Tanny in the British soldier in World War I that let Hitler go on the battlefield in World War I and could have shot him and spared him. And so he would have died in World War I. Maybe we're going back a little too far, but how about that one, huh?
But that's probably wishful thinking. Since there was still very much a cult of personality around Hitler, we might have seen the assassination spun as martyrdom to rally the people. Or let's say, for example, that Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, became the new Führer. We know that he secretly attempted to broker peace with the Allies behind Hitler's back in the real world. So with Adolf gone so early, we might have seen a less tortuously slow Nazi defeat.
So the war would have ended a few months earlier. Okay.
Number 5. Hokushin Run. In the years preceding World War II, right up to Pearl Harbor, Imperial Japan had two competing strategies in its military. There was Hirohito Run, aka the Strike North faction, and Nanshin Run, also known as the Strike South faction. The two opposing doctrines sought to either expand north into Russia and China, or south into the Pacific and take on the Western powers. As we know, they chose the latter and felt the consequences.
Right.
But what if Hokushin Ron won the day? It's hard to say for sure, of course, but if Hirohito took on Stalin, Siberia likely would have been a prime target. We can
Interesting thing, because again, the precedent was the Russo-Japanese Wars right at the turn of the century, which, I mean, would have been 30 years since then. And the Soviet Union was a very different place than Imperial Russia, which is what happened there. They would have put up a much better fight in this second war. But the thing is, Japan was also more powerful. Japan was just so technologically ahead of their neighbors around the beginning of the 1900s, that it gave them such a leg up. So what if Japan had not gone south? So was he saying not even get involved in China? Because when you go down south into Southeast Asia, what Japan is getting involved in there is the colonial possessions of like the French, like French Indochina and stuff like that, which again also concern the Americans, because the Americans are an ally and have economic interests in that region as well. But are they also saying that, okay, so Japan does this invasion into Russia while at the same time the Germans are doing theirs? And would anybody have done anything? Would anybody have cared about Joseph Stalin? Probably not, right? Because, okay, what if Germany didn't attack, like, France? Because now we're getting way off the branches, right? What if it was just Germany and Japan invade Russia? Germany doesn't go into France, etc., Western or Northern Europe, and they just go after Russia. Probably no one goes after the Soviet Union, and people are probably applauding that because communism was the naughty word of the 1930s as well, for much of the world.
We can somewhat safely assume that Japan would have fared well against the Siberian defences, since its forces hadn't been worn down to nearly the extent of the other major powers. That could have had a cascade effect on the Eastern Front with Germany. If Stalin had to divert forces to fight Japan, or if the Siberian reinforcements on the Eastern Front weren't available, Hitler's Operation Barbarossa could have drastically shifted the war effort in his favour. Number 4, Nazi nukes.
Ooh, what if they had nukes? We know the Nazis were, I think, in some kind of stage. I don't think they really got that close, but especially hurt because during their anti Jewish, policies and stuff like that, they end up driving out a lot of scientists. And ironically, some of them going to America and helping in the Manhattan Project there. So if they hadn't had kicked out some of these intellectuals that way, could have been a different story. Germans could have developed atomic weapons.
Historians are split over whether Hiroshima and Nagasaki was actually the move that ended the war. But you could argue that if someone less restrained, say a fascist expansionist leader, had access to nuclear technology, their continued use could have brought the Allies to their knees. That's especially true considering how vulnerable London was to German V-2 bombers. Now, imagine if they were nukes.
I mean, they were able to basically bomb London into oblivion, and could have easily dropped one on London.
That said, there are a few big reasons that didn't happen. For one thing, German military science was heavily focused on Hitler's so-called superweapons, like the outlandishly large V3 cannon and the Sun Gun, most of which turned out to be a waste of money and manpower. On top of that,
I don't know about the Sun Gun. Someone let me know what that means. What, like, put a big magnifying glass in the space and then, like, condense light and just burn up like you would a magnifying glass on ants?
Politicization of education under the Nazi regime led to an exodus of mathematicians and scientists making progress.
Einstein. His family was able to get out.
Much slower than it could have been. And lastly, the theoretical physics that formed the basis of nuclear tech was considered Jewish science by the Nazi Party. So it wasn't.
Talk about a social policy backfire by atomic science being considered Jewish science, therefore it needs to be discarded, and how that put them behind in the whole, I don't know what you want to call it, physics race.
Wasn't given the attention it should have had. Number 3, Hitler takes Russia. As we've
Okay, what if? That wasn't going to happen, right? Does anyone really believe that was possible?
seen, Operation Barbarossa was pretty much make or break for Germany. Just imagine the sheer amount of resources that went into marching on the Eastern Front in 1941, getting within 20 kilometers of Moscow and then being pushed back to Berlin and eventually defeated in 1945. But what would happen if Germany succeeded in Russia? Well, in a book titled Unmaking the West, historian Holger H. Herwig suggests the easiest way was if Stalin left Moscow for his second home called Kuntsevo-Dachau, which he very nearly did in real life. Herwig suggested that if fail-safe explosives inside Kuntsevo were triggered and killed Stalin, the Soviet organizational structure would crumble. Then he postulates that the leftover Soviet leadership would cut a deal to give Hitler all of European Russia.
So really, it's not even take Russia, just take Stalin. Take Stalin, and then it's, they probably seek a treaty, giving up a ton of land, Lebensraum, right, to the Germans.
An extreme resource boost, Hitler would likely have the manpower and equipment to take Western Europe pretty convincingly.
Because that's what a lot of people need to remember, was that going into southwestern parts of the Soviet Union was for resources, oil, stuff like that, places around Stalingrad, take the Volga River, because the resources the Germans required for their military was non-sustainable, right? So you get, the living space, but also it's the resources, oil.
But here's the twist. Herwig reckoned that nuclear weaponry would still hand America victory. So, in this reality, with Russia, Germany and the UK pacified, America would emerge as the only world power. Number 2, Spanish involvement.
There's always been an interesting one, because I get this asked in class quite a bit, which is when you had the Spanish Civil War and you get like Mussolini and Hitler, you get the Germans and Italians kind of helping out there with a fellow fascist leader, which was Francisco Franco. What if the Spanish had actually helped fight in this? I mean, the issue was that the Spanish Civil War was going on, which Spain, the fascist party here was dealing with that. But yeah, so Spain is kind of seen as like neutral in the war, just because they didn't really fight the other nations involved after the Spanish Civil War, which brought in actually a lot of nations. A lot of people like to say the Spanish Civil War was kind of like a dress rehearsal almost for what World War II will become. But pretty safe to say, a lot of people, that they say is that if Spain was going to fight in the war, then it would have been on the Axis power side. And especially if Franco and his fascist group had won out, which they did.
Back in the real world, Spanish dictator Francisco Franco never entered the war in any official capacity, though he was friendly enough with Hitler to send a division to fight on the Eastern Front. But what if Franco followed through on his promise to join the Tripartite Pact with Germany, Italy and Japan? Would it have tipped the balance in the West? Probably not, as it turns out. You see, Spain had been economically decimated by its civil war, with 10 to 15% wiped off its national wealth and a 28% drop in per capita income over just 4 years.
Hard to fight a war and then fight a bigger one right next to it.
According to Professor Mark Grimsley, that economic hardship would have actually made Spain somewhat of a liability to the Axis powers, since it would have required substantial aid to get involved.
Well, okay, so that makes sense. It could have been worse. We see that in a way with the Germans have to prop up the Italians when the Italians were starting to struggle, and some that kind of ticked off Hitler was like, hey, we're sitting here carrying your butts and we get nothing, right? Saying this to Mussolini.
So Grimsley theorized that the most likely outcome would be that once the Allies liberated Italy, Spain would see the writing on the wall and surrender, with Franco replaced by monarchy once again. So admittedly not the most wild change, but it would have meant around 40 years less fascism for Spain. Number 1, D-Day fails.
Very much in the realm of possibility. Even the leaders weren't necessarily fully confident. Go ahead and if you look sometime, look at General Eisenhower's letter he had drafted and ready for the failure of D-Day. He had it ready to go to the press. saying how they had failed and, sorry they were, and don't blame the soldiers, blame the leadership. It's a really kind of a somber alternate reality thing. Look it up sometimes, the Eisenhower's D-Day failure thing. So what if the Allies were never able to open up a second front of the war? I'm still on the side that the war still, the Germans still lose. The Russians had it. It definitely sped it up, but the Russians probably would have had it.
D-Day tops most war enthusiasts' lists of important battles in World War II, so it probably makes sense to examine why the outcome was so crucial. Let's say the effort fails. What on earth would have happened? It's pretty likely that the failure would have spelled the end of FDR's presidency, whether because he chose not to run again or because he was defeated by an isolationist candidate. World War II is often touted as the springboard to America's global dominance, so turning away from the world at such a crucial juncture could have massively altered the global order.
You can see that. America becomes a superpower because of the success of World War II, basically leapfrogging a whole bunch of nations and surviving it. But even still with that, because the war would have been devastating, and the United States still would have been an economic power, but it did solidify that for sure.
And across the Atlantic, it's likely the burden fell on Russia to beat back the Nazis completely. If Stalin did emerge victorious, his real-world post-war actions proved his eagerness to expand the USSR. That means
Could happen. Soviet Union would get bigger, take over more territory, become larger, become virtually an empire. Very likely.
wherever else Russia liberated in this timeline would have become a Soviet satellite state. So whether communism or fascism won that bout, it's pretty likely that Europe would have fallen under authoritarian rule. Good job we won.
Yep, doesn't matter. Just change the authority. Hitler, Stalin, one of the two was going to happen.
Right? So that was 10 ways World War II could have ended differently. Can you think of any other alternative timelines? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, check out 10 Unsolved Mysteries of World War I, which is on screen now.
Okay. And we'll on that slide. Okay. All right then. So what do you guys think? What do you think about the 10 things that they said there? Could you rank them? Try this maybe. Try ranking them in most plausible to least plausible, meaning more likely to happen, to happen, and least likely to happen, right? I guess you could do that, and I don't know if that list would then also be similar to which ones would have the biggest impact versus the ones that would have the least impact. But yeah, a lot of things to think about there. All of them somewhat, I think, in the realm of possibility, but again, differing greatly on what effect it actually would have had. So, yeah, but interesting to kind of see some of those played. Hopefully I was able to add a little bit of context, add a little bit of my opinion there. And if you agree with that, disagree with that, great. Get a discussion going. Better yet, come join our Discord server. There's a link down below. You come join that and get involved. The World Wars channels are some of the most popular ones that people like to talk about. And you'll probably get some good responses from people there. But regardless, a lot of ways that you can share with that. So, all right. Okay, good stuff. Overall, again, I think it was a pretty good job there at bringing up a lot of just parts, major turning points of the war. That's really almost, in a way, what this was 10 turning points of the war. That, big events that changed the war in some aspect. And obviously changing those would then have big outcomes, right? Changes in outcomes of the war, potentially. Some not so much, but... All right, awesome. Okay, on the way out, as always, if you like this original video, go down below. Link to the original will be there. Thank you again to patron pledgers who have pledged and then are given access to vote in these polls. So thank you very much. Thank you to our channel members, especially you guys that like to hang out in live streams. The channel memberships are a lot of fun because you get some features for our live stuff. Thank you to everyone that's been joining up in the recent quiz nights. If you don't know about that, I do occasional quiz nights. We use quizzes or Kahoot and have a good time. Usually I have hundreds of people that join in. And we quiz on all kinds of topics. It's a lot of fun. So another reason you may want to sub and enable those notifications specifically so you know when those things are. All right, with that, we'll go ahead and end here. Thanks again for being a part of our community and promoting history education, and we'll see you next time. Bye.